September 27th, 2024. The Appalachian Mountains, USA. This fall, the United States was hit with a catastrophic weather event, with Hurricanes Helene and Milton seemingly hitting the states of Florida within weeks of each other. Helene possibly proving to be the most taxing to the residents of the Appalachian Mountains of the Carolinas and Tennessee. Waters rushed down mountainsides, washing out roads, causing mudslides, displacing homes, and leaving death and destruction in its wake. This area, perhaps not ready for a swath of damage like this one, will most likely take years to redevelop. However, during this dire time for the residents of this part of the United States of America, the internet started to be lit ablaze by conspiracy theories. But not just any conspiracy theories. Theories consisting that these hurricanes weren't naturally occurring phenomenon, but rather they were being created to target specific areas of the country for political reasons, and that these storms were being used as weapons by the government. Today we dive into the theories and evidence surrounding weather weapons, and to find out whether or not this could be science fact rather than science fiction. Could we figure out, does the government have access to these type of developmental weapons, and if so, have they been used? And what is the limit of their capabilities? Today on Unblurring the Unknown, weather weapons. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. I am your host, Dominic. And if you can tell kind of by the audio quality, is because I officially have my podcast studio space up. So it might sound like there's a little bit of a echo. And that is because I am in a much smaller room now compared to where I used to record. So obviously you will hear me talk, and I'm not talking as loud. But there's also more of an echo in my new studio. So I don't have to talk as loud. I don't have to hurt my voice, yelling into this microphone. So you all could hear me clearly. But with that being said, and that kind of update into my life with the studio, and it's going great so far, I just want to offer you a little disclaimer before we get into this episode. And just based off the intro, you can kind of see that there might be some undertones of themes that I don't normally discuss on the show. And I want to go over that again before I dive in. This show is not political or religious. My personal views are not reflected in my content or my show, and I want you to be aware of that. But with that being said, there might be moments of the show today that will mention political themes. And for that, I want to offer a disclaimer in advance and tell you I am here to provide the facts to you all, not pick a side. Because if anything, I hate everyone equally. Now, before we dive into the episode, I think it's important to note, now, it is next to impossible to determine an exact date for when the idea of weather weapons or weaponized weather truly became a thing. So because of that, and because of the dozens upon dozens of articles being out there on this topic, and different stories in every single one of them, I want to go over some of them, and some interesting finds done in my research to see the extent of which weather weapons exist, and how they function. Now, you might also ask, wait a minute, you just said they exist. There are no theories this week? And that's where you would kind of be semi-right. Now, within about 5 minutes of a Google search on this week's topic, it is very apparent that the U.S. government has used weather manipulation numerous times throughout history, and still very well could be. The extent of the lethality, and whether they are being used for malicious military activities, will be what we are truly looking for. Now, of course, on the surface, the idea of man manipulating the weather has been around since the dawn of man. We have used spells, dances, and other techniques to try and make the weather behave to our benefit. Of course, we all know about what a rain dance is. However, it would come to a surprise to no one that eventually man would be able to harness the ability of the weather for their benefit. And on the surface, that sounds great. The ability to make it rain in drought-like environments would be extremely beneficial to humankind, and this type of weather modification is actually known as benign weather modification. Or at least, according to a U.S. government document I found that was written in 1997 by Barry B. Coble, who was a major for the United States Air Force. Now, of course, this term benign weather modification, I've only seen it mentioned in this article by Barry B. Coble, or Major Coble, I should say. But this idea that just influencing it to rain or having techniques to disperse fog, things like that. That is what the U.S. military calls benign weather modification. Of course, there is no malicious intent about that, and of course, we will dive into the malicious side of weather here in a little bit, but I want to go over this document that I found because I think it has some very interesting tidbits of information. Now, in this document, Major Coble makes the argument for benign weather modification and its practices throughout the United States military. Major Coble had quite an extensive resume, including environmental simulations analyst at the United States Air Force Environmental Technical Application Center at Scott Air Force Base, and that is a mouthful. He was also the Technical Operations Officer at the 86th Weather Squadron at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, and he was also a 1996 graduate of the School of Advanced Air Power Studies. Now, throughout this document, Major Coble is arguing on behalf of benign weather modification and its uses. However, he also acknowledges the time and money that has to be spent to improve the field, and that since the 1970s. Now, since the 1970s, the U.S. government has had no interest in further research into benign weather modification, and he says this in this document. In the abstract of this report, Major Coble states, and I quote, "Weather modification is a technology once embraced by the United States military as a tool to help both wartime and peacetime missions. However, interest in the ability to modify weather has waned over recent years and is now nearly non-existent." Now, there's a very important part of this document that gets mentioned, and one in which I had no idea was even a thing, and that being the United Nations actually has a law, or code, or treaty, or however you want to call it, in which it is against UN law to use weather modification to hurt or maim people, which of course I will come back to later. In this document, Major Coble states that the first monitored effort by the meteorological community for weather modification came in 1948 by Dr. Irving Langmuir, and I hope I pronounced that right, when Dr. Irving started experimenting with artificially seeding clouds to make rain, and he actually had mild success. Now, this is where the efforts of weather modification, seem to be focused in the early stages from what I could find. Now, seeding clouds to make rain, of course, that doesn't seem very negative, and that doesn't really seem like there could be any negative implications behind, seeding clouds to make it rain. Seems very trivial, seems very, not normal, but very easy. Like there's no malicious intent behind that. Or at least, not yet. Now, later on in this document, after Major Coble does this kind of brief history lesson on weather modification, he also talks about Dr. Joseph Golden of NOAA, NOAA, who briefly mentions the need to possibly modify rain clouds so that they produce more rain to fill in for the continued increase in water usage and to also refill underwater aquifers. Now, keep in mind, this was in the 1990s, but another thing mentioned in this document is the following quote. Dr. Golden also sees 3 new likely areas of weather modification research: ice storm suppression or abatement, hurricane modification, and tornado modification. These 3 areas, he believes, will be the focus of new weather modification efforts due to recent disasters. For instance, in February 1994, ice storms in the United States caused more than $1 billion in damage. Hurricane Andrew devastated southern Florida in 1992. Tornadoes continue to threaten many areas of the United States and kill an average of 92 people per year. Dr. Golden expects that the impetus to seek economic benefits, as well as technological and computational advances, will spur increased funding of weather modification research. End quote. Of course, what is notable here is the hurricane modification part of that statement that Golden hoped would be a focus because of these influx of severe natural disasters. Again, this document was written in 1997, and there's been quite a considerable amount of time between 1997 and 2024, of course. Now, of course, that does go back to the reason of why I'm doing this episode in the first place, because of these wild internet rumors surrounding Hurricane Helene. But back to this government document, as there is a little bit left I do want to go over with you. And another little part of this entire thing that I found interesting is Major Coble stating that the United States government has used benign weather modification in the past with positive results. such as a fog dispersal system being used at the Fairchild Air Force Base, and that the US government has not conducted research into benign weather modification since the mid-1970s and has no future plans to. However, of course, this could have changed since the publishing of this document, and spoiler alert, as we do find out, this has very much changed since the publishing of this document in 1997. Now, regardless of all that, I found everything in here very compelling and knowledgeable, especially because the US government has this technology, but due to UN treaties, technically they are barred from using it in wartime applications. However, that wasn't always the case. Now, in a magazine titled Science for the People, Volume 4, Number 4, published in July of 1972, there was an article detailing the U.S. involvement with modifying the weather during the Vietnam War to benefit United States troops. Now, this is confirmed that the United States started manipulating the weather over Vietnam during what was called Operation Popeye during 1967 and later in 1971 during a project called Intermediary Compatriot. That's a word. The United States government likes their big words. Now, Intermediary Compatriot, it was when the U.S. used cloud seeding technology to make it rain exponentially over villages along the Ho Chi Minh, causing some villages to completely wash out. Now, what would be the purpose of doing something like this? Well, let me tell you. The U.S. found it beneficial to do this for a few reasons. Modifying the weather could give strategic military advantages. In this article, it quotes another report stating, and I quote, "Weather modification could be used to achieve longer-range military, economic, or political effects that we generally think of in conventional warfare. For instance, strategic rainmaking could be used to slow infiltration, or adjustments of dry and wet weather during growth and harvest times could disrupt the economy and social structure of a small country. It could create famine, or at least extreme hardship." This article, published in 1972, like I mentioned, reported that in the last year, the Pentagon had roughly spent $10.5 million on weather modification research. Again, that is in 1972. So I got to thinking, what is $10.5 million in 2024 compared to 1972? Now, $10.5 million in 1972 is comparable to roughly $75 million converted to 2024 money based on inflation, which is a considerable amount of income at the time to set aside all that money and say, hey, we're going to use this to basically research how to make it rain over parts of Vietnam so we can completely wash away villages, we can wash away crops, we can wash away economic centers, we can wash away military installations. That in and of itself, $75 million, I guess, is not a lot if you're thinking about in terms of military and how big military budgets are, but it is quite a lot of money to put into something that maybe at the time you weren't even fully sure if it was going to work. Now, the United States using weather for warfare purposes would not last very long, as once the United States withdrew from Vietnam in March of 1973, the U.S. Senate would pass a resolution and campaign to other countries for there to be treaties in place preventing the environmental and geophysical modification of the weather. Now, in my opinion, this is pretty fucking ridiculous that the United States government would use weather warfare to benefit them during the Vietnam War, and then when they pull out of country after losing, in a sense, because the United States did lose the Vietnam War, they then push for a ban on it. I know that there was also Soviet influence in this decision to push the UN to pass a treaty banning weather modification, but still, perhaps maybe this was the United States' way of saying, hey, look, if this came out that we used weather warfare and another country started developing this technology to use against America and its interests, it would be very bad. Maybe that was what they were thinking of. It had to have been what they were thinking of, because why would they go and say, hey, UN, we want to stop people from doing this. But guess what? We were doing this, which I guess is pretty hypocritical, but I guess that's the United States in kind of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But that is just, of course, my opinions. But I guess I also understand it from their perspective as well. Regardless of the interesting timing of it all, the use of weather as a weapon of war clearly has been outlawed, but that hasn't stopped U.S. interest in modifying the weather clearly for their benefit. Clearly in the Coble document, he stated that the U.S.'s interest in weather modification had faded, and that for there to be any reasonable progress towards advancement of the technology, there would have to be time and a reallocation of funds necessary to support further research. Now, in an article I found from airandSpaceForces.com titled, and I quote, "Weather Ops, the Air Force's Next Great Weapon?" It highlights the Air Force's current use of weather for military applications. Colonel Patrick Williams, Director of Weather at the Air Force Headquarters, can be quoted numerous times throughout this article, saying that the manipulation of weather can lead to strategic advantages, clearly meaning the U.S. decided to start setting some money aside in the years following Cobal's document being published in the late 1990s. Now, Colonel Williams states throughout this article, and I'm going to quote numerous kind of sentences he does. It's kind of like a continuation of a paragraph, so I'm going to add some pauses in there so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. It looks like he has some type of conversation with the interviewer, although it doesn't seem like the interviewer's questions were included in the article. So I'm going to read pretty much Colonel Williams' statements in their entirety from this article. And I quote, "The way weather is used today, we're an obstacle. Before the pilot takes off, we'll tell them what conditions they'll see, which impacts how much fuel they'll need, how many bombs they can carry, and how to get back safely. We can do so much more than that." And then he continues, "We can purposely force the adversary into situations that they don't want to be in, where they have to pick between a bad choice and a worse choice. Now you've created an extra dilemma for the adversary. Every time a storm front comes through, they have to decide, do I hangar my aircraft and create a nice big target, or do I leave them out to the elements and take that chance?" Now, what Colonel Williams is alluding to is the idea of using weather to make very bad storm conditions to affect enemy plans and Air Force capabilities. Now, the article also states there is a military application to these types of weather modification techniques that can be used to affect target rings on surface-to-air missile systems, as well as being able to predict when a solar flare would occur, and then when to time that with a electromagnetic pulse weapon, so that an enemy force, for example, would be completely confused and disoriented from the total satellite system blackout that would cause. Now, that statement in and of itself is crazy, and if you have no idea what an electromagnetic pulse is, do some research on it. Pretty much it would take out any electric system, internet, pretty much everything as you know it that is connected in some way through electricity. It would be completely wiped out. And if you couple that with a solar flare or a something of that nature, that would be catastrophic for anybody who would have that in terms of communication. So for warfare applications, that would be an immense tool to use. So that in and of itself, if the United States military has the capability to do that, Colonel Williams is certainly kind of alluding that they have the ability to do that. That is a very crazy tool that the military has at its disposal. Now, Colonel Williams advocates for using the weather to your advantage, as it is an ever-present force that you have to deal with no matter what. The article states that with the tensions escalating between the United States and China, that a conflict within the Asian and southeastern part of Asia with kind of the tropical climates, that this is something that's realistic, a conflict in the Asia region and particularly southeastern part of Asia, obviously with there being the conflicts within China and Taiwan and then other little conflicts in that area, that it would be extremely beneficial to control the weather in that area because it is so unpredictable, to help establish air dominance in the region quicker and more effectively than compared to prior conflicts, like World War II, for example, where establishing air dominance was extremely challenging and time-consuming due to the unfamiliar weather patterns that the United States was facing at the time. So, clearly, again, the United States has backpedaled its stance on using weather manipulation, but again, there are treaties barring the United States and other countries, for that matter, on using this technology to harm people. However, do we have any evidence that the U.S. or any other country, for that matter, it has these weather weapons and that they plan on harming people? Do we have any proof to say that? And that's where this thing gets fishy. We are probably never going to know the extent for the United States or any other country, for that matter, what their capabilities are when it comes to modifying the weather, and we might not ever know. However, that hasn't stopped other countries from claiming the United States is using these weather manipulation techniques on them. In an article published in November of 2023, it claimed that numerous Russian news agencies were spreading rumors about a US-based weapon that was creating bad weather throughout the country of Russia. Now, during this, the following news sites, and I might butcher some of these names, Ukrainia.ru, I'm sorry, I told you I was going to butcher some of these, Komsomolskaya Pravda, I think I got it. I apologize again. I think I got that one. Don24, Crimea News in Privet Roslov put out these theories that a large and severe storm system that moved through the area of the Black Sea, Crimea, Ukraine, and Russia was actually a fabricated storm by the United States, and that the United States has a top secret program capable of doing this. And in these news articles and these conspiracy theories that they shared around, they even referenced an earthquake in Turkey in February of 2023 and said that there was a connection between this earthquake and the presence of the USS Nitze being in Turkey at the same time. However, in this article, they also admitted that there was no evidence to support the idea that the USS Nitze and this earthquake happening in Turkey, that there was no evidence to support the idea that the U.S. had used some type of weapon to cause an earthquake in Turkey. They just kind of speculated it. So, as interesting as that might be, and as we touched on earlier with the kind of statement in Kobol's article that earthquake, hurricane, and tornado modification was something that obviously was being looked into, it's very interesting to think about the idea that if we had a weapon to create these mass weather events, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, again, a tool like that would be immensely, immensely valuable to any fighting force on the planet because you can instantly debilitate any country's arsenal, their economy, their workforce, their fighting force just by unleashing the powers of the weather. And that's even before you do any type of military action, whether that be bombing, whether that be an invasion. Unleashing a herd of bad weather would be an instant, not knockout blow, but you'd be on the mat for a few seconds before getting back up, and that's before anybody even started slinging bullets around. However, this entire thing makes me very curious, because even though there are global laws about hurting people from weather weapons, triggering an earthquake, if even possible to begin with, would kill people, and possibly injure hundreds upon thousands, and that would most certainly violate global UN law and treaties. Now, is this treaty void if it's not on purpose? And I wanted to find that out, and I actually did. Through a tiny bit of digging, it turns out that the treaty is extended to even damage and destruction, but still seems like a morally foggy gray area, especially with the advancements in geoengineering that the US has done, and of course we just talked about that with the article featuring Colonel Patrick Williams. But with all that being stated, where does that leave us? Are these weapons real? Now, I think there is no doubt in my mind that they are real. It's a question of whether or not the United States would use them on their own citizens in other countries, and for that, we have no evidence supporting that. Now, the rumors circulating the internet about the Hurricanes Milton and Helene being made by the government just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and the lack of evidence to prove it is damning. Although I do not doubt that the US government could have the technology and know-how to produce massive storms and modify the weather for warfare purposes, but of course they are barred from doing so because of international law, or at least to hurt people, that is. I just don't think that there is enough of anything to look at and say that the rumors could be true. I just don't see it, unfortunately, but I do love a good conspiracy theory every now and again. Now, this would normally be a part where I would go into possible theories and everything like that, and honestly, I think I discussed all my personal opinions already and how they kind of tie in with all my theories on this. And I do think weather weapons are real in some capacity, but it is limited. I think that there is not a shadow of doubt in my mind that the US government probably, or any world government for that matter, possibly has a weather weapon that could do harm to humans, if not kill humans. I fully believe that, and I think that these governments are barred from using them, but for whatever reason they have them. in a world where we revolve around the idea that nuclear war could be an ever-present threat, and that everybody has nuclear weapons, in an age where all the world governments decided to get together and say, hey, we're going to have nuclear disarmament, I feel like weather weapons would suddenly become the new, I wouldn't say nuclear weapon, but they kind of would in an instant if, again, we're living in a fantasy world here. It's definitely a very, very much a possibility. But I think governments are obviously barred from UN treaties to say, hey, you can't do this. But of course, there are some countries who just, I don't know if they don't follow UN laws, but again, countries are barred from doing this. I don't think any country is hurting people with the weather. But again, I would not put it past governments to have weapons of these capacity and have just not used them and are either refining them, tweaking them, experimenting with them to possibly make the weather worse. And in some instances, maybe the United States is deploying these weather weapons to foreign countries to aid out other countries. For example, the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Could it be possible that the United States says, hey, maybe we're going to deploy a weapon that unleashes, again, this really bad severe storm system into Russia, and it's going to really cripple their defense, and it's going to give the Ukrainian forces a chance to dig deeper into certain regions of the country. Now, again, that's, another made-up scenario, but that is a possibility where a weather weapon would very much come in handy. But would the U.S. government, or any other government for that matter, come out and openly say that they are using weather weapons in real-time warfare capacities? That is probably going to be a no, unless somebody botches it and lets one slip that, oh, hey, we used a weather weapon in Ukraine or Russia or in Israel or something like that. I don't think anybody's ever going to come out and say that, and probably everything related to weather weapons and the military's research into them is probably completely classified and locked behind numerous sets of doors. But with that being said, of course, that would normally take the place of our theories section, but that's kind of the theory on it. I do think they exist, and I do think that there are some that harm people. I think the rumors online circulating that Hurricane Helene, in particular, was manufactured by the U.S. government to target specific areas of the country because of its political affiliation. I think that is absolutely ridiculous. I think that is it's just ridiculous. Top to bottom, it's ridiculous. And I don't think that is the case whatsoever. And I don't think that the U.S. government would deliberately do something like that, especially if it came to like a weather weapon. The U.S. government has done tons of very shady things. But I don't know what would be their motivation for doing this. Because, again, I am recording this currently after the election, day after the election. This would be November 6th when I'm recording this, even though you're going to get this a week after. That did not affect the areas of North Carolina in terms of their voting status or how they voted. So, again, it would not give the United States government much motivation to do something like this if they, in fact, did create Hurricane Helene or worsened it. It just does not make much sense, and I just don't think that there's a lot of credibility there. But with that being said, that is going to do it on this week's episode of Weather Weapons. I hope you enjoyed it. Back in the realm of kind of government conspiracy theory-esque, and I definitely enjoyed this episode. Kind of hard to dig together sources to do a whole episode because, again, it is very vague on some of these things. And I felt like I dug through a variety of articles that kind of kept it different, kind of gave you some background, kind of gave you a little history. And I felt like this is a very fun episode, especially for somebody like me who does love history, and especially history of America in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, and learning about kind of the shady stuff the U.S. government did during that time period. Definitely very interesting. But again, with that being said, that is going to do it for this week's episode of Unblurring the Unknown. Hope you all enjoyed it. If you were listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. I greatly appreciate it. If you are listening on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out with the algorithm gods, and I greatly, greatly appreciate it. Hopefully I get on the algorithm sooner rather than later. I really hope so. So please do that. If you do not know, I am also on TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown, where I post 1-minute breakdowns of the episodes that I do. Hopefully getting a little bit more active on there recently. Hope to stay up on it. Hope to keep releasing content now with the new kind of pseudo studio that I'm working out of. Hope to be on there a lot more. You can also send me topic suggestions on Gmail, or my email for that matter. It is a Gmail though, unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. You can send those to me. You can also send them to me Instagram direct message. And I feel like every time I do these announcements at the end of the episodes, they just keep getting longer. And I just have no reason to stop talking so fast because I do that, and it's a problem. But with that all being said, I really hope you appreciated this week's episode. Again, please, this is kind of an all call for anybody who is listening to the show. Please send me topic suggestions. I greatly appreciate it. Of course, I have a queue that is ever growing and ever long, but I do topic suggestions. Please send them to me. I know that there's people who comment in my YouTube comments all the time. You can send me topic suggestions right there in my YouTube comments. That is totally okay. You can do that too. Put them down there. I greatly appreciate it. I'll add them to the queue. And again, all your support is greatly appreciated. But with that being said, that is going to do it for this week's episode. Again, I appreciate the support, and I will see you all on the next one.